of pure political motivation and terribly misguided and, I think, harmful kind of connection when it did not exist. We should not do that in this country. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. First, I want to thank my colleague for saying that political targeting should not occur in any way, shape, or form. So I would agree with him. And what this does is this ensures no political targeting going forward, which is important. We agree that political targeting shouldn't occur. This assures political targeting doesn't happen going forward. The other issue, when we talk about the change in the language, the current language says threatening to audit a taxpayer for the purpose of extracting personal gain. We talk about the same thing by saying performing, delaying, or failing to perform, or threatening to perform, or fail to perform any official action, including any audit with respect to a taxpayer for the purpose of extracting personal gain or benefit or for a political purpose. So we are actually protecting the integrity of the IRS going forward. This is a simple piece of legislation that really implements the will of the American people. It shows we will not allow our constituents to be targeted based on their political beliefs. This is the only bipartisan measure we will consider on this topic today. It simply improves an existing process that was approved with overwhelming bipartisan support. As I said earlier, the IRS needs this. The hardworking employees of the IRS needs this, who have been tainted by this scandal. But let's remember, this has nothing to do with the scandal. Let's begin the long process of restoring faith in our government. Let's come together, put politics aside, and show the American people that the IRS is above politics. I urge all members to support this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2565? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and concur in the Senate amendment to H.R. 1911.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1911, an act to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to establish interest rates for new loans made on or after July 1, 2013, to direct the Secretary of Education to convey the Advisory Committee on Improving Post-Secondary Education Data to conduct a study on improvements to post-secondary education transparency at the federal level and for other purposes. Senate amendment.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Klein, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on H.R. 1911.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act, also known as the Smarter Solutions for Students Act. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. After many weeks of delay, I'm pleased we finally have a bipartisan agreement to address the student loan interest rate problem. My colleagues and I have been fighting for months for a long-term market-based solution that will serve students and taxpayers, and the legislation before us today will do just that. As you can see in this chart, much like the Smarter Solutions for Students Act approved by the House back in May, the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act will tie student loan interest rates to the market, taking away the uncertainty that comes with allowing Congress to arbitrarily set rates. Similarly, both bills provide a permanent fix to the interest rate problem, granting students the certainty they need to make smart, fiscally responsible investments in their education. And most importantly, this legislation, like its predecessor, doesn't unfairly penalize taxpayers. Unlike some half-baked proposals that would put taxpayers on the hook for billions of dollars to pay for artificially low student loan interest rates, both the House-passed Smarter Solutions for Students Act and the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act will generate a small amount of savings over 10 years. Reports confirm the similarities between the House bill and its Senate companion. MSNBC has said the House bill is, quote, very similar to the Senate proposal. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune recently noted the Senate compromise, quote, closely resembles, close quote, the House-passed Smarter Solutions for Students Act. And the Associated Press called the differences between the two proposals relatively small. While I'm happy with the legislation we will consider today, I'm disappointed it took us so long to get to this point. Students and their families got roped into an all-too-tumultuous debate and were forced to deal with the fallout when Congress was unable to reach an agreement to prevent subsidized Stafford loan interest rates from doubling on July 1st. By getting politicians out of the business of setting student loan interest rates, the measure we consider today will protect students from future uncertainty. I applaud my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for finally recognizing this long-term market-based proposal for what it is, a win for students and taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, I strongly urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 1911, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California.
I yield myself 4 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act. It has been nearly a month since interest rates on student loans were allowed to double on millions of our neediest students. But thanks to the bipartisan negotiations in the Senate, we now have a solution that provides real relief. And I want to thank Senator Durbin, Senator Harkin, Senator Manchin, and Senator King for all of their work on this effort. Thanks to this legislation, over the next 5 years, borrowers across the country will save $25 billion in interest payments. In my home state of California, this bill will cut the cost of college by more than 550,000 students this coming academic year. It was worth the wait. When we started work on this issue, I said that any long-term solution to student loan interest rates must not harm the students or their families, must not make college more expensive, and it must protect students in the future from spiking interest rates. I believe that this bipartisan bill accomplishes that goal. It locks in interest rates for borrowers when they sign on to their loans. It provides a reasonable cap to protect students from rising interest rates, and it rolls back the doubling of interest rates, saving students and families real money right now. Today, the bipartisan student loan deal stands in stark contrast to the partisan bill passed by the House majority in May. The bill would have made college more expensive by nearly $4 billion to students and their families. It would have subjected students to a bait-and-switch scheme. It offered students teaser rates that balloon annually, leaving students with deeper in debt and guessing what they will owe. If you look at this chart, you will see that under the bipartisan agreement we're voting on today, students will cost students about $11,363. The current law raises the cost to $14,000, and the bill that passed the House under the Republican bill was $16,400. So it's been well worth students to have this disagreement, to have this wait, so that we could save this kind of money to students and families. Next year's freshmen who borrow a maximum amount of subsidized and unsubsidized Stafford loans over 5 years would have paid $5,000 more in interest rates under the House Republican plan. That under today's bipartisan compromise, nearly $2,000 more than if we did nothing. The House's majority solution wasn't a solution at all. Their approach was best summed up by the chair of the Higher Education Subcommittee, who recently said, "It's not the role of Congress to make college affordable or accessible." I couldn't disagree more. That statement explains why their bill piled debt on the backs of students rather than trying to lighten the load. The Senate bill before us today takes the opposite approach. It saves students and families money. I understand the concerns that some have raised by this solution. While it provides relief for the next few years, it does not solve the long-term student debt crises. We have much more work to do to address the underlying cost of college. We must remain on guard against any unacceptable rises in interest rates. In the meantime, we now have a bill that will make a positive difference to families struggling to pay for college. Today, I ask the Republican majority to drop their support for the original House bill that was so devastating to students and families, and instead support this bipartisan bill that delivers real interest rate relief for millions of Americans, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like now to yield 4 minutes to the chair of the Higher Education Subcommittee, the gentlelady from North Carolina, Mrs. Fox.
The gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
4 minutes, please.
4 minutes, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for yielding time. I rise in support of the Smarter Solutions for Students Act, renamed as the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act by the Senate. It's about time that bipartisanship on this issue won the day in Washington. Earlier this year, my colleagues and I warmly welcomed the President's ideas to settle how student loan interest rates are calculated. Referencing his plan and its premise that student loan interest rates should be permanently free of politics and set using market interest rates, we introduced and a bipartisan House majority passed the Smarter Solutions for Students Act in May, well before rates were scheduled to double on July 1st. Our friends in the Senate were on a much different schedule. Rather than immediately building on the striking similarities between President Obama's initial proposal and the House Republican solution, Senate Democrats chose infighting over completing this important work. July 1st came and went without any agreement from the Senate. Rates doubled. But advocates of common sense and bipartisanship made a better case. Last week, Senate Democrats finally chose to support a permanent, market-based solution much like what the President had originally requested and practically identical to our Smarter Solutions for Students Act. Campaign promises and political posturing should not play a role in the calculation of student loan interest rates. As we've seen, Washington's involvement in the rate-setting equation is a recipe for uncertainty and confusion. Borrowers deserve better. The Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act will apply a predictable market-based interest rate to all federal Stafford and PLUS loans, ensuring that student and parent borrowers will be able to capitalize with certainty on low rates while being shielded from high rates by specified caps. From personal experience, I know that paying for college is hard work. It's getting harder as tuition and fees increase, and the vast majority of American households are feeling that pressure. The need for solutions to help ease the challenge of college affordability is especially acute in today's jobless economy. Many recent graduates took out loans with the expectation that they would be able to find a job to pay off their debt. Now many find themselves among the 53% of their peers struggling with or underemployment. Like our colleagues across the aisle, we want every student to have the necessary honest information they need to make an informed decision about the financial obligations they voluntarily assume. And we want taxpayer subsidies for higher education to be well spent, not wasted. Now with interest rates settled permanently for students and taxpayers, the Higher Education Subcommittee I chair will continue to look for and promote solutions to help bring clarity to college costs for all students and families considering the investment. Students, families, and taxpayers deserve a long-term student loan solution, not more can-kicking from Washington. The Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act, like the House-passed Smarter Solutions for Students Act, puts an end to temporary fixes and campaign promises that have failed to strengthen our nation's student loan system. This legislation offers students simplicity and predictability as they prepare to pay for college. The American people deserve the clarity, certainty, and protection guaranteed by this legislation. I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from California.
I yield myself 30 seconds. I would just say
Gentleman recognized.
I would not want the members of this House to believe that somehow this bill that we're going to vote on in a few minutes is the same as the Republican bill. This bill saves $25 billion for those students over the next 5 years. The Republican bill that was voted on in this House cost those students $1 billion. So there's a big difference. As I say, it was well worth the wait. So let's understand very clearly. The members of this House are getting a better deal with this legislation if they vote yes on this bill on both sides of the aisle. And I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut.
From Connecticut is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, rise in support of the Student Loan Certainty Act, and again want to emphasize the fact that compared to the product that came out of this chamber on May 23rd that the majority passed on a partisan party line vote, which the White House issued a veto threat, the final bill that's before us here today is a far superior piece of legislation that protects students. Again, as Mr. Miller said, the numbers don't lie. The bill that the Republicans passed on May 23rd had a 4.3% interest rate, which was a teaser rate. The bill that's being passed here today is 3.86%, and over time that nets about $5,000 of additional savings for students. That's real money, and that certainly is something that's worth the wait. But what I want to point out is that there is actually, in my opinion, a more fundamental difference which is so critical for borrowers, which is that this piece of legislation will fix the rate at time of origination. In other words, when students take on these 10-year notes, which is what Stafford student loans are, the rate is fixed at the time the note is written. The bill that came out on May 23rd was a floating variable rate product, which would not be set until the time that students commenced payments. Some students take Stafford loans out over a period of 5 and 6 years. So the rates that they were touting back on May 23rd were an illusion. They were not what the rate was that the student actually was going to be paying. And again, for this country, which went through the trauma of the subprime mortgage variable rate fiasco, this is a critical difference which provides greater protection for the borrower. If you go online today, a 30-year mortgage for a house is about 4%. For a student, for an auto loan, it's about 3.8%. They are fixed loans if you took those loans out today. And that's exactly what this compromise creates, is that there'll be real borrower certainty and protection, unlike the bill that recklessly and on a partisan party line basis flew out of this chamber on May 23rd. This is a better deal for America's students. It's why, again, the process that we went through was worth it, and again, it's certainly worth people's support. At the end of the day, though, let's remember, students are still paying into the deficit of this country. Congressional Budget Office has told us over 10 years, $184 billion of revenue is going to be generated through this program towards the deficit. We need to change that. That's not the purpose of the Stafford Student Loan Program. When Senator Stafford from Vermont passed it many years ago, it was about providing an affordable system of access for higher education, not a cash windfall for the coffers of the government. And that's why we have more work to do. That's why we need to pass a Higher Education Authorization Act, which again balances these priorities in the right direction for students, not for government coffers. And again, this legislation gives us the time to address that issue and come out with even a better program for students, which again is good for them and good for our country to make sure that we have a workforce which is ready for the challenges of the future. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes now to a member of the committee, the gentleman from Nevada, Dr. Heck.
Gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act of 2013. As the first in my family to go to college and as a parent, I fully understand the value of a high-quality education and the opportunity it provides. I also know that accessing higher education is not cheap. Just started paying back the student loans of my daughter, and I'm still paying back my student loans for medical school. Throughout Nevada, many new high school graduates are preparing to head to college this fall. Without this bipartisan compromise, originally proposed by the House Committee on Education and the Workforce and based largely on the President's own proposal, students face significant uncertainty over their student loans. This legislation provides a permanent market-based solution that gives students and taxpayers the certainty they need and deserve. Additionally, by ensuring the interest rates are set by the market rather than legislators, this bill rightfully takes politics out of the student loan discussion. While we must continue our work to address the skyrocketing costs of higher education because the much greater issue is the total indebtedness upon graduation, this bill is an important step in addressing the near-term needs of students. I strongly support H.R. 1911 and urge the passage of this important bill to help not only Nevada's students, but students throughout our nation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes? 3 minutes. Gentleman recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise today in support of the underlying legislation. Although this compromise is far from perfect, it is a step that must be taken in order to provide financial relief to American students and their families. This legislation will bring undergraduate interest rates back under 4% for the upcoming academic year, a far more sustainable and appropriate level than the current 6.8% rates. Graduate students and parents will also benefit from lowered interest rates within this bill. Importantly, and in contrast to the bill that previously passed the House, the legislation also locks in those interest rates for the lifetime of each annually dispersed loan, providing student borrowers with critical consumer protections and a measure of predictability. Finally, this compromise provides interest rate caps for all student loans, offering an essential safety net to protect students and their families from the whims of market-based rates. While this isn't a bill that I would have written, we must all recognize the urgency of our current situation and pass it today. Classes are starting at many institutions within just a few weeks. Students around the country are signing their master promissory notes even as we speak, committing themselves to years of debt and loan repayments in order to make an investment in their future. At the very least, this Congress has a responsibility to momentarily end the political gridlock that paralyzes our nation and notify these hardworking students what their interest rates will be. However, let's not think for 1 second that our work on college access and affordability is now complete. With the Congressional Budget Office projecting interest rates of 10-year Treasury notes, the baseline that determines student interest rates, projected to rise significantly over the next 5 years, we must work proactively and cooperatively to ensure affordable student interest rates not only for present students but future students as well. American student loan debt now stands at more than $1.1 trillion, and it continues to rise. The federal government continues to make a huge profit on student loan repayment, even as students are forced to shoulder more of the burden than ever before. Reducing our deficit on the backs of students is simply not right, especially when considering the broader economic impact of saddling students with untenable amounts of debt. When borrowers are forced to devote huge chunks of their paychecks to student loan repayment, it means they will have less income to spend on major purchases like homes or vehicles. They are less likely to start a business. They are less likely to invest in retirement accounts or the stock market, all negative economic indicators that will affect our economic prosperity now and into the future. Mr. Speaker, college education has represented a path to the middle class for millions of American families. Taking direct action to bring down the cost of a college degree by lowering student loan interest rates is a step in the right direction. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to yield 2 minutes now to another member of the committee, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, as an original co-sponsor of H.R. 1911, the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act, I rise in support of the Senate amendment to H.R. 1911. President Obama, as part of his budget request proposal returning student loan interest rates to a system of market-based variable rates tagged to a 10-year Treasury note. Now, as a member of the Education Workforce Committee, I can attest to the committee staff and the members who worked in good faith to meet the President's request, developing a bill that could pass the House and promote certainty for student borrowers. The House moved to pass a bill in May, reasserting that access to education for so many America's young people should not be subject to the annual political battles. Unfortunately, the Senate chose politics over students and delayed passage of the legislation until last week. The positive is that H.R. 1911 is a complete departure from what had become an annual debate within Congress on how to set the rates for student loans. This measure modifies how interest rates on most federal student loans are set, returning to a system under which interest rates are tied to market rates, but with rates fixed for the period of the loan. Now, it would apply retroactively to any loans taken out by students since July 1st, when the interest of 3.4% on Stafford loans rose to 6.8%. This bill will transition the student loan system to one that is more predictable and affordable, one that protects both taxpayers and students. We have a responsibility to America's youth. We have a responsibility to students, such as those seeking opportunity at Penn State, Pitt, Lock Haven, Clarion, Edinburgh, Juniata, Du Bois Business College, and South Hills. And we have to put forward a long-term plan for college affordability. This bill is a good first step and will offer students the lowest possible rate for higher education while ensuring the solvency of these important loan programs. And I urge my colleagues to support this common-sense, bipartisan legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. Gentleman from Minnesota reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
I yield 3 minutes, Mr. Chairman. To
3 minutes?
From Colorado, Mr. Polis.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased that finally we are taking action on a pressing issue of college affordability for constituents of mine across Colorado and Americans across our country. Absent congressional action, the current law today has effectively doubled the interest rate that our neediest families pay to be able to borrow money to afford college to 6.8%. I believe that the previous bill that passed the House was better than the doubling to 6.8%. It would save families money, at least in the short and medium term, while Congress worked through a final solution. And I'm very proud to say here today that this bill is far better. And I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bill, which has several features that are strong improvements over the original House-passed version, including a fixed interest rate for the life of the loan so that our students are not beholden to the fluctuations of the market when they can least afford it after they graduate. This bill would keep interest rates low for our neediest students and families and provide some certainty and some surety. Under this bill, the typical undergraduate student borrower this year will save $1,500 over the life of a loan. A graduate student save over $3,000. This bill is a step towards making sure that our student loan system is not subject to the whims of Washington every week with arbitrary expirations and control over the interest rate. We have to make sure that our students are able to plan their futures. Now, this bill is but the first step in the much-needed reforms that we need as we reauthorize the Higher Education Act. I encourage all of my colleagues to support this bill to keep college affordable now, and I hope that my colleagues will be able to consider Representative Petrais and my H.R. 1716 bill as we look towards long-term solutions. The Excel Act, H.R. 1716, would replace this complicated array of loans, subsidies, deferments, forbearances, and repayments with a single loan repaid through simplified and improved income-based repayment. One of our goals is to protect our neediest Americans. Income-based repayment is a better tool than interest subsidies. While interest subsidies are based on a student's family income before school, income-based repayment ensures that students are protected when they truly need it, when they graduate from school, if they go through tough times, or if they're in a service-related profession. Under the Excel Act, while we have strong borrower protections, and our neediest students will be paying effectively a 0% rate for the balance of their payments. Now, we need to pass this bill now and send it to President Obama to prevent our students this fall from paying 6.8%. And I hope that we can continue the discussion and dialogue about thoughtful student loan reform proposals like the Excel Act that address keeping college affordable for American families. I am so grateful that Democrats and Republicans have come together to hopefully pass a bill here today that will be able to be brought to President Obama for his signature that provides some common sense and predictability by lowering the student interest rates from 6.8%, which they are under statute today, and putting us on a path towards fiscal sustainability. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, could I inquire as to how much time is remaining on each side?
Gentleman from Minnesota has 10½ minutes. Gentleman from California has 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 3 minutes to another member of the committee, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Messer.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Smarter Solutions for Students Act, also known as the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act. I commend Chairman Klein, Higher Education Subcommittee Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Miller, and others for their hard work and diligence throughout this process of getting this bill where it is today. I am pleased that cooler heads have prevailed and Senate Democrats finally have agreed to the common sense solutions proposed months ago by House Republicans and the President in his budget to stop interest rates on student loans from doubling. This is a good deal for 11 million students. The rates are better in this agreement, and students will save an estimated $1,500 in interest over the life of their college loans as a result. Those beneficiaries include more than 200,000 students in Indiana alone who will be taking out their student loans this year. Young people like John Houston, a Ball State University student and intern in my office this summer, who will be taking out student loans as he heads back to school this fall. Getting Congress out of the business of randomly setting interest rates is a good deal, both for students like John and taxpayers. The bill will allow students to benefit from lower interest rates and prevent taxpayers from being forced to subsidize arbitrary rates set by politicians for political reasons rather than for policy purposes. Maybe most importantly, Mr. Speaker, this legislation shows that even in a challenging partisan environment, Congress can come together and work on behalf of the American people to make their lives a little easier. I hope this agreement builds momentum for reaching bipartisan solutions to other problems that our nation faces. I urge my colleagues to support this measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Indiana yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes. Gentlewoman is recognized without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm just delighted to be able to say that the leadership of the Senate realized that the Republican bill would have overwhelmed our young people. I was just talking to someone just a few minutes ago, and they were saying we need to have a commitment that every person that graduates from college have a job. We should also have a commitment that every young person that wants to go to school and get a higher education should not be burdened with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. And for over 2 years, our good friend Mr. Courtney from Connecticut has been begging, and the Democrats have been begging, and the Education Committee has been begging, Mr. Miller's been begging, we've been begging on behalf of the American children to not cause them to pay this enormous amount, but to hold the interest rates for middle-class families and working families, 3.4%. And we struggled, and there were many discussions in the United States Senate. And the reason why they continued to struggle is because they wanted to make sure that the victory came out for those young people of working parents and middle-class parents. That's why we're here today, because they held out and we held out. And now we're glad to be in a bipartisan mode. But it's important to note that this was a struggle. And now if we pass this bill and get it on the President's desk, the 3.6% or so will be held. And as we go forward over the years, we'll have a measured increase, not a high increase to market rates or rates higher than that, but a measured increase, 3 or 4 or 6%. And then some 5 years out, when it reaches about 7%, we'll have the ability as a Congress to come back and look, because we should not burden our students to the point where they cannot get an education. We all are created equal. Maybe education is not written in the Constitution, but certainly the opportunity for the pursuit of happiness, and therefore the opportunity for education must be protected. This is a crucial difference. Bipartisan Senate bill of 11,000, current law right now 14,000, and what the House Republican bill passed was some almost $17,000. Mr. Speaker, this is a relief. This is to be applauded, and I am delighted that we finally come to our senses. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from Minnesota reserves.
We have no other speakers, so
I have no further speakers, so thank you. I thank the gentleman, and I want to thank the chair of the committee for bringing this bill to the floor as soon as it was possible to do so, certainly before we break for August. This legislation, as I said earlier, is a vast improvement over what we voted on before and what was presented to this House. And I think it's that families all across the country with students heading off to college or returning to college this fall will be happy to know that as they take out a student loan this year, they will save over the next 5 years some $25 billion because those loans that they take out will have that interest rate guaranteed at that rate today and for the life of that loan. Big distinction between this bill and the bill that was presented for the House to vote on, which many of us rejected, but the Republicans supported and was passed to the Senate. Over the next 10 years, it provides about $4 billion in additional relief. And what's important to know is that this will deal with making college more affordable. But clearly what is on the agenda of the Education and Workforce Committee is making sure that we're dealing with the cost of college. So that when we can reduce the student debt in this country, we can reduce the affordability of college in this country. And we expect that as we struggle to try to figure out how to provide this loan money on behalf of the taxpayers to these students who are the future of our economy, the future of our society, that the institutions will struggle with seeing what they can do to lower the cost of these colleges. This is a very exciting time in post-secondary education because we have opportunities now with technologies and the ability to present classes in new formats and new forums for students much differently than in the past. And we've got to make sure that we're providing that quality education, but perhaps in a way that's more cost efficient. And efficiency isn't the enemy of intellectual curiosity or intellectual achievement or scholastic achievement. But it may be helpful to those families who are struggling with the debt to provide 1, 2, or 3 children a college education, or for those students that graduate who are struggling with that debt as they enter the job market. So we really want to say that we've done the best we can under these circumstances with this legislation, but we expect the institutions of higher education all across this country to re-examine how they're doing their business and what they can do to make college, to reduce the cost of college, and we'll continue to do our part trying to make it more affordable for the American families. But in the past, we've seen where we've put money in at the top and the states took the money out the bottom. We're not going to play that game anymore, and we can't play that game anymore. And that's ended up with a lot of increased debt on the parts of students. Certainly with respect to the public institutions, the states have to step up and share the responsibility for their public institutions. We cannot have this situation where they continue to decline their support and then foster that off on parents and students, and then the parents and students need help from the federal government. That chain has got to stop here. But I think today this is a big and important step in terms of the affordability of college for students, and all of the indicators are that college degree is well worth it over the lifetime of work of students, over the types of jobs that they will get, the types of wages that they will receive. It's still a huge benefit. There's been a lot of discussion over the last few months that maybe college isn't worth it anymore. It is. But we have to do it right, and children have to be, and young people have to be able to obtain that college education, and they have to do it with the least amount of debt possible. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
California yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
It's always interesting to listen to the debate here on the floor, and no matter how hard we try to use the word bipartisan, we get into these partisan squabbles. The Republican bill was bad, and this bill is good, and that bill is... Look it. We needed to change the status quo, and that's always hard to do. We had some pretty simple goals here that we were trying to reach. We wanted to get out of the partisan political squabble that was occurring in this city every year, as we tried to figure out through some alchemy what the student loan interest rate ought to be. The answer has been in front of us for a long time. The market is the best determiner of that. So we wanted to put together legislation that would get us out of this political squabble, let the market do this in a way that was fair to students and fair to taxpayers. Let the market do it based on the 10-year Treasury, which is the best indicator of what it costs the federal government to borrow money. Do it so that it was as close to budget neutral as we could get it. The President of the United States had a proposal that did those things. At the end of 10 years, I think the President's budget saved the taxpayer about $3 billion. The House bill that we've been discussing saved the taxpayers about $3.5 billion. And this bipartisan Senate bill just under $1 billion saved. That's budget neutral in this city in a 10-year window, the Congressional Budget Office. We're trying to get that. It was a bizarre circumstance, Mr. Speaker, that I and House Republicans were working with the White House and the Department of Education trying to convince our Senate colleagues, Senate Democrat leadership, that the answer was there in front of them. All they had to do was pick it up and pass it. We can get it done in this House. We can answer the questions of parents and students and put some certainty in this. And I am very, very pleased that the Senate was able to put together that bipartisan. Happy to yield.
Just before, I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you were going to yield back your time. I just wanted to ask you for 30 seconds.
Happy to yield.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and we have these differences at the member level and then the institutional level. I forgot before I sat down to thank the staffs of both sides of our committee for their professional work, because whatever's going on the surface here in surface warfare, we know that underneath the staff is trying to make it work out however we decide to, whatever direction we decide to move in. So I just want to thank so much the staff, both of the majority and the minority side, for their help.
I thank you, gentlemen. Reclaiming my time.
Minnesota is recognized.
I will pick up on that note because we could not have done this without the hard work of some really instrumental people. Certainly, I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank the committee staff, as my colleague has done, for their hard work on this important issue, both sides of the aisle. First, I'd like to thank the Majority Staff Director, Julianne Sullivan, and our Education Policy Director, Jane Bergeron, and professional staff member Brian Melnick, and of course Amy Jones, sitting next to me here today, who started working to solve this problem more than a year ago. And that's a frustrating thing here, Mr. Speaker. This problem didn't arise in April or May. We've known for more than a year with certainty that we had to address this issue. So I thank Amy for her passion in all higher education work, and I know she's just resting up so we can start into reauthorization of the Higher Education Act as we go forward. And certainly, I'd like to thank Virginia Fox, the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Training, who helped craft the Smarter Solutions for Students Act. This was, and again, I would remind my colleagues, this was a bipartisan bill, came out of the committee bipartisan, came off the floor of the bipartisan vote, and Mrs. Fox deserves a lot of credit for her hard work. In closing, I remind my colleagues the legislation before us today is a victory for students, families, taxpayers. It deserves our robust support. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Minnesota yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and concur in the Senate amendment to H.R. 1911? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from California.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
Yeas and nays, excuse me.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purposes, the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 850 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 850, a bill to impose additional human rights and economic financial sanctions with respect to Iran and for other purposes.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
In opposition.
Gentleman from New York opposed to the motion? Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, could I ask then for unanimous consent, because I'd like to yield the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, 1/2 of my time, and if we could have unanimous consent that he be allowed to control that time.
Without objection, the gentleman from New York will control 10 minutes. The gentleman from California is recognized for 10 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask also unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks, and I ask consent to enter into the record my correspondence with the chairman of the other committees of referral on this bill.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I'll yield myself such time as I might consume.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there is no higher national security priority than preventing a nuclear-armed Iran. Foreign Affairs Ranking Member Engel and I have worked closely in a bipartisan way to bring this legislation to the floor, and we do it with the unanimous support of the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, all Democrats and all Republicans on that committee. And indeed, 375 members of the House are co-sponsors of this legislation. And that's the broad recognition that exists right now, that more needs to be done to stop Iran's nuclear program, which is a danger not only to us in the United States, but certainly to the region and to the world. Today we act with that sense of urgency. Urgency because Iran's march to nuclear weapons continues, and in less than 2 years, the International Atomic Energy Agency has told us that they have doubled in Iran, doubled the installed centrifuges at the facilities at Natanz and Fordow. They've doubled those from 8,500 to more than 15,700 centrifuges, and these new centrifuges, many of them are 5 times more powerful. They spin much faster than those earlier models. A key facility is buried deep below a mountain, and Iran continues to stonewall the IAEA on its development of nuclear explosive devices. So Iran's intent to develop this weapons capability is very evident. New president in Iran or not, I am convinced that Iran's supreme leader intends to continue on this path because that is what he says he intends to do. And that is, unless sanctions bite to the point where the regime has to make a choice between compromise on this nuclear weapons program or the consequences of the sanctions on the regime. And that is why this legislation dramatically steps up the pressure on the regime in Iran. It targets the energy sector by compelling countries that are currently purchasing oil from Iran to reduce their collective total by 1 million barrels per day within a year. It targets additional sectors of Iran's economy. It further denies the regime access to foreign currency reserves. It effectively targets Iran's efforts to circumvent international sanctions against the shipping sector in the country. And equally important, this legislation increases sanctions against Iranian human rights abusers, making clear that it's the Iranian people that we are siding with. Only when the Iranian leadership truly feels a choice between maintaining power and obtaining the bomb does our diplomacy have a chance to succeed. And we know the Iran regime's view of the world. We know it only too well because its support of keeping the brutal Assad regime in power is self-evident. It has resupplied Hezbollah with 25,000 new rockets which target Israel. In recent years, there have been Iranian-sponsored attacks or plots uncovered by the Europeans in Bulgaria, also in India, Thailand, in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, in Cyprus, in Kenya, and even here in Washington, D.C., I'd hate to see an Iran emboldened by a nuclear weapon. But that is the course we are on unless we dramatically step up the pressure. So let's pass this bill. I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 20 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues come here today proposing this new intensified legislation on the basis that they would like to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon. So do we. Everything that my colleague Mr. Ross detailed a moment ago is something that we're concerned about. But we have a changed circumstance that this legislation does not acknowledge, and that is that the Iranian people had a choice between candidates, and they selected the candidate who decided to reject extremism and actually campaign on the basis of moderation. Why not, at least until Mr. Rouhani has a chance, forestall legislation like this and engage in diplomacy to reach the goals that Mr. Royce has identified? Mr. Rouhani ran on a policy of promise to pursue a path of moderation. He promised to pursue a, quote, policy of reconciliation and peace. Well, obviously, we don't have rose-colored glasses. We don't know. But why don't we wait and see? Why aren't we at least curious to find out whether or not President Rouhani means that he wants to pursue this course of peace? It's what we want is negotiated settlement. Why are we slapping his hand down when apparently the Iranian people are willing to support a candidate who is willing to extend a hand? The New York Times agrees. It said, quote, while sanctions are an important element of American strategy, piling on more at this time and this moment could harm rather than advance the chances for a negotiated deal with Iran. In fact, Secretary of State John Kerry warned that additional sanctions at this moment might undermine diplomatic efforts. The fact of the matter is, why do we want to strengthen the hand of extremists who will say to Rouhani, see, you thought you could work with them. We were right all along. I say they're wrong. I say let's accept the olive branch extended by the Iranian people who selected a more moderate candidate. In fact, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit this document to the record. Its headline reads, Mohammad Javad Zarif, Iran's nominee for foreign minister, seen as an olive branch to the United States. And so,
without objection, so ordered.
And so let me also acknowledge and ask unanimous consent for an introduction to the record this letter dated July 19th by 130 members of Congress on a bipartisan basis to say President Obama pursue negotiations in this window of time when we have a president who won on the basis of extending a hand for negotiation.
Without objection, so ordered.
We don't have to do this now. We can do this when we come back after at least Mr. Rouhani is confirmed and inaugurated into the presidency of Iran. So with that, I will reserve time. I do have a number of speakers in case we're ready for that.
The gentleman from Minnesota reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 10 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. I rise in strong support of H.R. 850 as amended the Nuclear Iran Prevention Act of 2013. It's been a pleasure working with Chairman Royce to craft this bipartisan legislation, which, by the way, passed unanimously in the Foreign Affairs Committee. Every Republican, every Democrat voted yes on this. It now has more than 370 co-sponsors. We share the goal of preventing a nuclear-capable Iran, and I could not ask for a better partner than Mr. Royce in this effort. Mr. Speaker, I think all of us agree that a nuclear-capable Iran would pose a grave threat to the U.S., a threat to our allies in the region, and a threat to the future of the global non-proliferation regime. And all of us are aware that Iran has violated numerous UN Security Council resolutions and repeatedly blocked IAEA inspectors seeking to investigate its nuclear program. After many years of deceit and stonewalling by the Iranian regime, I continue to hold out hope that we can achieve a peaceful resolution of the Iranian nuclear crisis through diplomatic means. But time is growing short. According to the IAEA, Iran is installing advanced centrifuges to enrich more uranium and continues to build a heavy water reactor that could produce plutonium. We must not allow the Iranians to play the same old game, engaging in endless negotiations with no results while continuing to advance their nuclear program. That's why we must continue to pursue a two-track approach to Iran, one that incorporates both pressure and negotiations. The legislation before us today will significantly ratchet up the pressure and hopefully give our diplomats the leverage they need to persuade Iran that its only viable option is to end its pursuit of nuclear weapons. Among other things, this bill seeks to cut Iran's oil exports by another 1 million barrels a day, a reduction of 2/3 from current levels. It also strengthens existing sanctions by authorizing the President to restrict significant commercial trade with Iran. In addition, the bill seeks to deny the Iranian regime hard currency by enhancing efforts to cut off Iran's access to euros. Finally, the legislation imposes new sanctions against Iranian shipping and ports and expands existing sanctions against Iranian human rights violators. Mr. Speaker, some of my colleagues argue that we should delay sanctions until after the new president of Iran takes office. I respectfully disagree. I know they share the goal of preventing a nuclear-capable Iran, but I believe we should take a different approach. Our efforts to impose new sanctions should not be based on the Iranian political calendar. In my view, the paramount consideration should be the Iranian nuclear clock, the nuclear calendar, the amount of time it will take Tehran to achieve a nuclear weapons capability. I have no reason to believe that the results of the recent Iranian election will fundamentally alter Iran's current course. The unelected supreme leader, the Ayatollah, remains the one true decision-maker at the pinnacle of the regime. And President-elect Rouhani, who was directly involved in efforts to deceive the international community when he served as Iran's chief nuclear negotiator, made clear during the campaign that he supports Iran's nuclear ambitions. If Rouhani, I yield myself 30 additional seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 additional seconds.
If Rouhani truly has the will and authority to make a bold gesture on Iran's nuclear program, like suspending enrichment, he has a small window of opportunity before this bill becomes law. I think all of us would welcome such a gesture, but I'm not holding my breath. In closing, I'd like to reiterate that by strengthening sanctions, we're not calling for an end of diplomacy. After many years of fruitless negotiations, it's clear that talks will only succeed if the regime feels pressure to change course. And that's what we're trying to accomplish with this legislation today. I look forward to working with Chairman Royce to ensure that the strongest possible sanctions are enacted into law, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize Congressman Price from the state of North Carolina for 3 minutes.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in reluctant opposition to this measure before us today. I've supported the repeated rounds of sanctions that Congress has already enacted. I've supported them because of the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran and because of the intransigence of the Iranian government in defiance of the international community. These sanctions have brought the Iranian economy to its knees. They have yet to produce meaningful concessions by the Iranian government. I've thus remained open to the possibility of additional sanctions as part of a broader strategy to induce the Iranian government to change its course. But the bill before us today could not come at a worse time. In 3 days, Iran will inaugurate a new president, Hassan Rouhani, elected on promise of moderation and openness despite repression and intimidation by the Iranian regime trying to deny him that election. Since its election, Dr. Rouhani has made repeated overtures to the international community, signaling his intent to resume the stalled P+5+1 nuclear talks upon taking office, promising greater transparency and confidence-building measures. He reportedly intends to appoint as his foreign minister a seasoned diplomat who favors closer ties with the West. Now let's be clear. We don't know whether Rouhani truly intends to follow through on these promises. We do not know whether he'll be able to overcome the resistance of Iran's hardliners. We do know that history counsels us to be cautious about the prospects for meaningful change in Iran, and that Rouhani's actions will surely speak louder than his words. But to rush through a new round of sanctions before the new president has even taken office could slam the window of opportunity shut before we even have a chance to test whether it is genuine. A recent letter to the President, signed by a group of respected former diplomats and military officials, including Ambassador Tom Pickering, former commander of CENTCOM General Joseph Hoare, has warned that further sanctions, quote, could empower hardliners in the Iranian government who are opposed to nuclear concessions, at the expense of those seeking to shift policy in a more moderate direction. Moreover, by removing the President's authority to relax sanctions on countries that are cooperating with our strategy toward Iran, this bill risks shattering the unprecedented international coalition which we have worked so hard to build, and thus making sanctions less effective than they are at this moment. Some argue that we should not be concerned about the House passing this bill. It'll be some time, they say, before the Senate follows with an improved bill, and longer still before the new sanctions take effect. I must say that's not a very compelling argument for rushing this bill to the floor right now. Why not act when we can assess the diplomatic prospects more accurately? Mr. Speaker, I'll take a backseat to no one when it comes to my concern about the threat posed by a nuclear Iran, to our ally Israel, to the broader Middle East, and to the United States. I believe we must redouble our efforts to secure
30 seconds.